I'm Sarina Fazan, taking a risk, making a difference, and changing the course of your life. Remarkable stories from people defying the odds. You're listening to On the Record.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Sarina Fazan here, and invited back to the podcast is retired. I always want to say, Jim, like I keep on wanting to say retired investigator, but you're not really retired.
Retired makes me feel old.
I know. So you're a current investigator.
He's a man of leisure. Law enforcement.
Current
investigator.
Yes, former law enforcement, current investigator, and of course, one of my absolute favorite attorneys ever, prominent criminal defense attorney in Tampa, Paul Sisco. Thank you both for coming back to the podcast.
Thanks,
So when we were here last time, we talked about Joe Exotic, Tiger's Lies and Cover-Up, and the disappearance of Don Lewis and that cold case. I wanted to invite you guys back to talk about another cold case that, Paul, that you have really been involved in, and now, Jim, you have also taken an interest in, and it's a young woman, Jennifer Kesse, who, as a journalist, I reported on the case for several years. She's been missing now for 14 years.
Right.
Can you just tell us about her?
Well, Jennifer comes from a very loving family. Actually, live in Bradenton currently. Parents and a brother that have never stopped doing everything they can to try to find out what happened to Jennifer. Jennifer went missing in the end of January of 2006. A very talented young woman, 24 at the time. Had just been working at a new job in the finance industry for a little while, a good job, and was intent with her family on finding a safe place to live, and they found what they believed to be a safe place for her to live in a condominium over in Orlando. And a parent's worst nightmare, a family's worst nightmare, they get a call that she didn't show up for work, one morning, and they instantly went over to Orlando and found that she was not there. The apartment looked relatively intact. No one was at least willing to say they saw anything of what had happened to her. Her car was missing. She was incredibly reliable in terms of calling folks and showing up at work. And so the moment she didn't show up at work, the family knew instantly something was wrong. Unfortunately, as is the case, law enforcement didn't take it that seriously because people do go missing, and for the most part, they do show up in relatively short order thereafter. And so it wasn't looked at as a matter of foul play until about 48 hours had gone by, and then the car showed up at another apartment unit about a mile down the road. And unfortunately, since that time, while the family has just been tireless in trying to find out what happened and involved as many experts and legal counsel and everything they can do to try to find out what happened to their daughter, up to this point, they don't know what happened to her, and they continue to try to keep this in the national attention and have had success doing that. But at the same time, there's just haven't been any satisfactory answers either.
And Paul, I have so many questions for you after what you have shared, and it's heartbreaking, as you said, a parent's nightmare. You met Jim Rathmann when we were all shooting Joe Exotic, Tiger's Lies, and Cover-Up. And so, Jim, you've solved cold cases before, and you're working on this disappearance of Don Lewis. So when you heard about the Jennifer Kesse case, what was going through your mind as an investigator?
I actually recall the Jennifer Kesse case because I was actually working in a detective division when it happened. So anytime you hear something like that happen all across the country, you always pay attention to it. Not to mention, I was born here in Orlando. I may have grown up South Florida, but I was born here. I have family around here, around Orlando area. So you kind of take a personal interest when it's so close to home. Mm-hmm. And so I remember this case. Even today, when you go drive around Orlando, you still see some of the flyers up. Have you seen Jennifer Kesse? Do you have information on Jennifer Kesse? Call this number. So you take a personal interest in it. I can tell you I've taken hundreds of reports of missing persons during my career. And much like what Paul says, a lot of times these people turn up. They had a bad day, they had a fight with a spouse, whatever the case might be. They go off the grid for a short time frame, then they come back. And then the very few times, and the small percentage of times, it turns into something so much more. And unfortunately, that is the case here with Jennifer Kesse.
And you know what, Paul? So I do want to go back to that question, because you said it was 48 hours later when they started to take it seriously. Within those 48 hours, I mean, I've always heard that is the most critical time.
It's certainly crunch time. I think it's probably, diminishes directly related to the amount of time that goes by from when an event occurred. And when you say it wasn't taken seriously, the family certainly was taking it seriously immediately. They knew.
Yes.
And that's what's so heartbreaking about this. But it appears that law enforcement was kind of, until that car turned up, they had missed those crucial, as you said, 48 hours. And that's where, literally the tracks are still out there many times. You can bring dogs out, you can pick up scents, people's memories are fresher and more accurate. And you let those first 48 hours go and you think that you'll be able to recover that. And I think that's probably where, that was the fatal flaw initially in this, unfortunately, all those years ago.
I appreciate law enforcement so much, and maybe, Jim, you can talk about this. And you already did when you said that it's very rare that it ends up being something like this. But why is it that sometimes that law enforcement may not take it as seriously?
It's not so much that you don't take it seriously. You got to look. If you look at this case specifically, like from what Paul had just laid out, yes, we understand that she's very timely. She has these things going on, but her car is missing. I'm quite certain they probably tried to call her, see if her phone is on, try different things. Maybe she'll use her ATM card. There's certain ways to see, is there activity with this person? And you got to give that little bit of a time frame to see, do they come back? Did they just do a trip on their own? They are an adult, so they may go and do something that the rest of the family is not completely aware of. Doesn't mean they're not taking it seriously, but also that can be the most critical hours to investigate a case, because you can't, the one thing you can't get back is you can't get back that time. You can't recreate those moments when they're already past. So it's like, that's your shot. And so it's unfortunate that law enforcement typically has to wait about 24 hours is usually what they'll wait before they can enter the person. Part of the process, you take a missing persons report, you wait till, you give it that specified time. Each department's a little bit different. You enter that person into a national database. We refer to it as NCIC. You'll put in their driver's license information, what they were wearing last, height, weight, vehicle. You give all the information you possibly can, and then it gets broadcasted out to all of law enforcement all across the country. And NCIC is a way that we can all communicate. So let's just say, as an example, she was driving in Miami and they notice the vehicle, they pull her over, boom, it has a hit, what's referred to as an NCIC hit. They will then reach out to Orlando and say, hey, we have this person, this is the NCIC number, what do you want us to do with them? Oh, well, she needs to get in contact with her family. Now we've established that communication, she's been found, right? That's a lot of times, and that happens. We'll get that all the time. I've entered people in and had them picked up in California, Atlanta, Georgia, New York. I mean, it can happen anywhere. But those are some of the steps that you have to take, and it's unfortunate and it's painful to sit there and wait, especially when the family knows this is completely inconsistent. Mm-hmm. But a real good investigator is going to know, they're going to listen to what the family's saying, they're going to know the history and the pattern and say, okay, I get that I can't enter just yet, but I'm slowly working this right now anyway because this is very odd.
So, and again, I really appreciate law enforcement. And from a journalist standpoint, I can tell you this is what we reported over the years. And Paul, maybe it's not fair for you to answer this question, but in this particular case, people have said that law enforcement did drop the ball.
You certainly hear that a lot in a lot of cases. And I don't ever really take that approach with law enforcement because it doesn't do us any good, right? We can criticize things that happened in years past. It's like any profession. The large number of folks are probably doing everything to the best of their ability. Sometimes the problem is, as I believe it was here in this case, is there was never really a quarterback from the law enforcement side. It changed hands so many times over the years that there was a lot of reinvention of the wheel, or frankly, ignoring of the wheel, and
Why
just
was
kind of
that,
controlling.
Was it different agencies that were looking into the case, or
No,
why
it
was that?
It was primarily the Orlando Police Department in this case, and to some extent some of the federal agencies that were involved. But the reality was, it was a case where it appears to me that they did not feel they had a great foundation to, keep it moving early on, and so you didn't have what you often have, which is a person like Mr. Rathmann or our, investigator Mike Toretta that wants to sink their teeth into this and find out actually what happened.
So Paul, you're a parent. You have two amazing children. Jim, you have three amazing boys. Paul, you've done so much of this case pro bono. You've done all of it pro bono on your end. What is it about this case? I mean, I can say, as a mother of a 13-year-old, of course, as you mentioned, it's a parent's nightmare. What is it? What is it about this case?
Well, I can tell you this: it hasn't been entirely pro bono for me. It's in large part, a lot of this is because I like this family and I want them to get resolution. But there's been hundreds of people in this case. It's amazing, really, when Mr. Kesse tells us about, or Mrs. Kesse tells us about the involvement that volunteers have had in this case. There's a whole legion of people in Orlando, but on the internet all over the place, that keep Jennifer in their thoughts daily. And
yes.
there's blog reports. Mm-hmm. There's and that's the fuel that keeps this going. But I have to tell you, what's really inspiring about this case is this family will not let this go unanswered. What happened to their daughter? I mean, it's impressive. It's also heartbreaking, mm-hmm. and it's also often frustrating, but it is the fuel that keeps this thing going.
That just gave me goosebumps because
Absolutely.
We have covered, when I worked at a local news station, we continuously covered stories because the family was keeping her alive in that sense. And do they, gosh, I hate even asking this, but of course, all parents hope, that their child is going to come back alive. Are they maintaining that hope?
Certainly, and that's important. They're not in the odds game. They're in the love game. They love, of course, love their daughter, and of course, the ultimate goal is to find her somewhere alive. They're also smart and they're reasonable, and they don't let the possibility or even probability of bad news get in their way. They work through it. I mean, this family, it's not unique about them because you see this in other families, but what is so impressive about them is they would rather work than mope about it. They would rather put that energy of despair into the energy of solving the case, and that's what I find most impressive.
It's a lesson for all of us. So, Jim, from the investigative standpoint, what do you think needs to happen all these years later to help solve this case?
Well, I think a fresh set of eyes that is going to keep an eye on this for as long as it takes. Much like what Paul had said in the beginning, it's almost like there wasn't a quarterback involved. And I know through my experiences, a lot of time when you assign a lead detective to this case, they hold on to it. You can add all the people you want to it over time, but there has to be one person that's constantly been in charge of the case, because then they know all the intimate details. They know when something doesn't fit. They can dictate to people where they need them to go, what they have to do in order to bring in the information. So, it doesn't appear that happened. If it's changed hands so many times previously, I don't know. I haven't had a chance to ever look at anything with it. But as an investigator, there's a lot of things that need to happen. One, going through the entire file, rereading every witness statement, every single account that has taken place, and starting to come out with your own timeline. Because for me, if I were fortunate enough to work on this case, I don't want any bias in it. I don't want what other people's opinions are. I want to be able to come up with those based on where the facts take me. And that's the biggest thing when you work a case, is you have to let the facts take you wherever the case is going to take you. And you work it, and you work every single angle of that until you can come up with something that makes sense. And so I think a fresh set of eyes, different ideas, technology being on your side, and not having that bias or that preconceived of who it could or could not be, because you haven't been tainted, so to speak, of what you may have heard here and there. You let the facts take you wherever it's going to take you. But when you commit to a project like this, it's all in 100% until it's finished.
Very good points. We're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about how this case has gotten national exposure and how maybe shows like this, and Paul, you've been interviewed on this case, how that could shed light to new evidence. So we'll be right back.
This podcast is brought to you by Zips Dry Cleaners. I'm Sarina Fazan. I don't know about you, but there are not enough hours in the day. Well, thanks to Zips, one less task on my to-do list. For only $3.49 per garment, they actually pick up my dry cleaning and drop it off. I get it the very next day. Just give them a call.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I'm joined by prominent criminal defense attorney Paul Sisco and investigator Jim Rathmann. We're talking about Jennifer Kesse, who vanished 14 years ago. And Paul, you and your investigator in this case, Mike Toretta, right, have been working tirelessly to help this family.
Well, Mike Toretta is a retired DEA agent, and he's been an investigator working for the family for about 3 years on this. And so he has been working with the file itself now and doing everything he can from his standpoint to help. And you know, it's as you may have guessed by now, this isn't a one or a two or even a dozen person case. This is an all hands on deck type case, and the older it gets, perhaps the more people it needs, and that's what this family's always done, is it has kept the eyes and the energy on it.
You know, the two of you met because of Joe Exotic, Tiger's Lies, and Cover Up, and Investigation Discovery doing a national series which aired on the disappearance of Don Lewis. That brought the two of you guys together, and we were talking about the Jennifer Kesse case. Paul, 48 Hours has done a story, right? And there's been an Oxygen.
Yeah, there's. Well, I will tell you this, as Mr. Kesse can tell you, they've been on dozens, if not hundreds, of national programs by now, and you know, that time period from 2006 to now has spanned the birth of the podcast. You know, during that time, and these national shows, and frankly, an interest in crime and unsolved crimes that is, I don't think has ever been at this level at any point in the country. And so, smartly, I think that family always realized that's where we've got to keep this, is in the national eye, and sort of ride this wave of publicity you get from these new forms of media.
Do you think these national shows can really help solve a case, and why?
I absolutely do. The reason for that, you know, when all the time's gone by, looking at the Jennifer Kesse case, it's been 14 years. So when you put on such get all this national attention to it, you don't know if it's going to trigger somebody's mind, right? It could be somebody that sat in a bar 10 years ago that had a little bit too much to drink and started talking and made some comments about something that only a person involved would have known. But that person can't realize it at that moment, but now they see this TV show and they connect the dots and go, well, wait a minute. That makes sense. And I remember sitting here, and that's the little piece of the puzzle, right? And so can you find out who that person is? They may know who they are. You know, you never know what leads can form from having such national exposure. It brings a lot of people out that were in the shadows that come forward with information. No tip is ever stupid. It isn't. Every tip counts. You know, and as an investigator, you look at every single one of them. You can either rule it out or it makes sense. But it's that somebody has that little piece of information, and every time it gets national exposure, the hope is to be able to pull that information out, get that person to come forward, and it helps. It really does.
Well, and there's this kernel of, you know, for all the good that they do, there's this kernel of sort of dread that also comes with those, which is, for the most part, it keeps it in the public eye, and that's its main value. But also, the media, of course, is its own species, and the media is there to draw ratings and to sell time and commercials and such. And so while in theory they're there because they want to solve a case, you know, the reality is they want to get eyes on their television or eyes on their show. And that's often frustrating to the family, because at the end of the day, what's in the best interest of finding Jennifer, or what's in the best interest of, you know, selling Budweiser during the course of that?
Right. You know, and Paul, you did bring up a very interesting point, many interesting points, but one that caught my ear too was, why do you think so many people are interested, currently in these crime cases, because and all these crime shows, I have seen it as well, and reality. Before we would sit there and watch, Law and Order, or, Criminal Minds, but I have found more reality and more crime is.
Well, I know that from what I've witnessed, you have coming from a large family and so on, you always have sort of that cousin or that family member who is the one that can always solve the Mannix episode or the Kojak episode if you're old like I am. They always want to say, oh gosh, I can figure that out. And there's a real interest in that. Some people are really gifted at that.
Mm-hmm.
They can, this is the person you need to talk to. And they tend to become the Jim Rathmanns of the world when they're growing up. I'm sure Jim, when he was watching Starsky and Hutch and trying to learn the lingo and so on, was saying, oh, I knew that Huggy Bear was involved somehow and so on. But the reality is there's a lot of that. And there's also sort of the feeling that, as Aldous Huxley said, there's going to come or maybe it was Edwin Murrow, I don't know, to be a nerd. There's going to come a day where information is everywhere without knowledge, meaning what we have essentially on the internet now. Everybody's got an opinion and there's data out there, but who can assimilate it? Who can put it together? Who's going to be that quarterback, that can make sense out of that information? I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people sitting there on the internet saying, this is cool, let me check this out, and frankly, move on to the next one if it doesn't suit their fancy.
So speaking of that, so Jim, you were looking into this Don Lewis case, and Investigation Discovery comes to you, and you truly become the star of that show. Did you? What is that like? I mean, did you? And I know that this is not your career. I mean, you played football. I mean, you really want to solve criminal cases, mm-hmm. But what was that experience like for you?
I mean, I loved it. For me, it was always remembering and always staying grounded, and the fact that you are working on behalf of the family. You're working to try to solve a case. So you're doing everything you can to do that. So yeah, it's different when you have camera crew following you around. It's not really natural for an investigator, but you get used to it. But at the end of the day, it was just keep doing what I do, keep moving forward, and keep trying to dig for answers and just put it out there. And it would be the same if that opportunity presents itself in the future for me. I would do it the exact same way. I'm going to continue to work that case. I'm going to be me and do what I do best and find those answers.
What Jim does and what Mike Toretta does, my investigator, is it's elbow grease. It's what you do, and there's no magic celebrity to any of this. Nobody gets to where they are without working hard.
Right.
And the people that are good at solving these things are the ones that are putting in the late nights sifting through records. It's not the ones that are suddenly forcing a Mike Wallace type confession out of somebody. That's rare.
Right.
So Paul, but let me ask you this. Oftentimes when you do weigh in on these shows, and you've weighed in, they have you sign a waiver, I mean, how protected do you need to be, from a legal standpoint?
That's a good question. I don't like those waivers. Mm-hmm. They're written for the benefit of the television show generally by their lawyers who are sitting in New York on an entire floor somewhere in 57th Street. And they're written to protect them. And so, the last thing you want to do on one of these shows is say, well, here's my suspect. Here's who it is, and this is why I think they're involved. If you're going to do that, you better be right, because you might be asking for a defamation suit. Mm-hmm. You might be asking whether they prevail or not. You're asking for a major headache at that point. So it's not uncommon for me, frankly, to sort of nerd up and start lining through those releases and changing language, and they don't like that. But frequently, I feel you have to do that.
No, I think that's a relief, though, to know that you do that, because, oftentimes I weigh in on these cases as a journalist. And in fact, I mean, I think that I should be calling you to ask you, is it okay if I say this, or is it, okay if I, say
you're
that?
You're welcome to do that.
You.
I mean, frankly, what I oftentimes think of is that a judge sitting out there listening to me rather than, a viewer. You really have to be self-protective in this business. And frankly, people are often wrong about their assumptions in these kind of things.
Well, back to the Jennifer Kesse case. Do you think with all this national exposure that is continuing, potentially maybe even another show, we don't know, do you think the family will ultimately get closure?
As I say all the time, I don't like being in the probability business. You have to think that's going to happen, or like, why are we doing this? Why would we put the family through this further if we thought it wasn't realistic? They deserve it, and so I don't know the answer to that question. I just don't know. But if we're going to be in this kind of business, you got to think it's going to happen.
What does your gut say, Jim?
My gut tells me that there are some answers out there that just haven't been uncovered just yet. Obviously, the family deserves closure. Nobody deserves that more than them. I mean, I feel for them. I really do. I feel that pain. And, one of the reasons why I like working on such complex cases like this is because there's no better joy than to be able to look at a loved one and say, listen, I'm sorry that your loved one isn't here, but here's what happened. And allowing them to be able to close that chapter of all that pain and hoping that they can open up a new chapter and start their life over again, or be able to go on to something where they can just memorialize their loved one in the way that they want to be able to do it. That's kind of one of those things that drives me. And in this particular case, it's my gut and my heart tells me the answers are out there. Go find it. And I feel determined more than ever to be able to do that. And even if I find just one big piece that at least helps in the overall case, I won't stop until I'm able to at least do that. And that's just who I am as a person. And I think the family deserves that kind of dedication from people looking at it.
It bears repeating too. I think I said it on an earlier program, but part of the, if you were weighing the benefits and cons of pursuing these after all these years for the family, because it's costly, mostly in emotional revenue, that they're going through, is you have to say, am I making whoever might be responsible for her disappearance just a little bit more uncomfortable? Am I making that person wake up at 3:30 in the morning and say, damn, why won't this family go away? Okay, that oftentimes is enough of a motivation. And whether that's what we're all here for or not, there's a certain satisfaction that comes with that.
Right.
Absolutely. So Paul, because you are so close to this case, if anybody does have information, what is the best way right now? Is it contacting your law office? Is it contacting the Orlando Police Department? What would you suggest?
Currently, the best way to do that is to look at the Find Jennifer Kesse websites and so on, and get in touch with the family or with my office, and I'll make sure that information gets to the correct place. The reality is that there currently isn't really any official law enforcement involvement in this at the moment. It's basically the Kesse family, but I will make sure that your program has exactly who they need to contact on your site.
Well, I hope you get involved, Jim Rathmann, as well. I mean, and bring closure to this family.
I think the family deserves it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on this podcast. We really appreciate you watching. Of course, I'm going to invite you back on. I hope you come back on. You can find me on all my social media channels, and we so appreciate your support. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Sarina.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.